Well, this Anzac Day, I want to take you back in time. I want to take you back to the trenches, and not the weapons that our soldiers were carrying, but the books that they were carrying. Yes, indeed, they carried books. Books specially designed to sit inside their pockets. This is an example of one right here, designed small enough to fit into the pocket and to be read in the trenches. They've been reproduced by Angus and Robertson. Neil James from the State Library of New South Wales has been on a quest to collect these books and has been behind this resurgence. Nice to have you on the program.
Pleasure to be here.
Extraordinary, isn't it, to think that the diggers took these books away with them? Were you aware of this before you discovered that, these books were out there? Did you know that this actually took place?
No, I came across it by chance talking to some of the old Angus and Robertson staff, mentioned the trenches editions of Australian poetry.
To be clear, you were doing a history of Angus and Robertson, and that's when you discovered these.
That's right, and asked them what were the trenches editions, and they were designed to fit in the top pocket of an Aussie soldier's battle jacket, and I thought, what an extraordinary thing that Aussie soldiers went off to war in World War I with poetry in their pocket.
And you're right, poetry in the pocket, because it also tells us what they were reading then as well, that these were men who read poetry.
Well, and poetry had a much more significant place in Australian society at the time. I mean, we don't tend to read a lot of it, but 100 years ago, this was the age of the bush ballad. From the 1890s through to the early 1920s was really a golden age of Australian poetry. Most newspapers used to publish poetry virtually every day, and it was a mixture of ballads. It was topical poetry, so there'd be a poet who would write on the issue of the day, and people were reading poetry as a regular part of their lives, much as today we would consume social media or television.
Yeah, that's what really strikes me. Incredibly literate. And when you read this as well, it takes you back to another time. This is not the sort of language that we're used to. I'm just going to read here a little bit from Ginger Mick. Now, when a bloke, he cracks a bloke for insults to a skirt and wrecks a joint to square a lady's name. They used to call it chivalry, but now they calls it dirt. And the end of it is cops and quad and shame. You're caught up in the language, aren't you? This is Australian Shakespeare, really, isn't it?
And that was the real feature, not only of the Trenches editions, but the poetry in general at that time. It was using the language of the people, and C.J. Dennis in particular. He copped some...
Well known for the sentimental bloke, of course.
And Ginger Mick. He copped some criticism for capturing the Aussie accent and spelling it, as to represent the way that the average Aussie bloke actually spoke. And this wasn't real poetry. This couldn't be these working class characters who were speaking with grammatical lapses and poor pronunciation. But it was real, it was authentic, it was telling stories that people could relate to, that people could understand. And yes, it was also poetry. Yes, it was also doing more significant and sophisticated things as literature.
There are some amazing stories. What you've got here are originals. Now, these are books that are 100 years old, and you had to track them down. How did you do that?
Just in bookshops over about 20 years.
So you went around to bookshops and found them?
Once I heard about these, I started looking out for them and picked them up one by one. And some of them are really quite poignant. I mean, this is
the original Ginger Mick.
An original Ginger Mick. And now, normally these books were very dark red. This one has been so water-stained, it's virtually salmon pink. And it has quite a moving inscription in it, dated 12th of December 1916, to Bert, wishing you the best of luck from Ivy.
So Ivy's given this to Bert, 1916, and Bert's on his way to war. So this tells a story, doesn't it? It tells us that here were two people who were in a relationship. I don't know what the relationship was. It could have been brother and sister. It could have been, they could have had another relationship. But 1916, he's heading off to war. But it also tells us that it came back.
Yes, and the book came back with him, fortunately. Not many of them did. Not many of the books did come back, perhaps understandably. But we do know that they were immensely popular. They sold tens of thousands of these, and that the diggers really read them very commonly. One example, for example, a story recounted diggers tearing them into chapters and passing them down the line of the trenches.
Really? Sharing them?
Sharing them. So you'd read one chapter of Ginger Mick or The Sentimental Bloke and then pass it down to the next trench. And then the next night it would be passed on again. And they were immensely popular. There's a lot of downtime in war.
Well, that's right, of course. You know, we imagine that you're not fighting every single day. There is a lot of downtime, and this was entertainment. But it also does more than that, doesn't it? It's entertainment, it builds camaraderie between the troops, but it links you to home, doesn't it? There is a connection to home.
It very much a connection to home. I mean, with the volumes of A.B. Patterson, of course, most of the soldiers would have known The Man from Snowy River.
Well, I've got the Man from Snowy River here. This is one of the reissues, but of course you've got originals as well.
And Will Ogilvie, not so well remembered today, but he was actually Scottish originally, but came to Australia, worked as a drover and a horse breaker and as a station hand in Western New South Wales and down through to South Australia. He wrote a poem called The Australian, which uses its key line, a quote from a British officer that said, "The Australian soldier is the bravest thing God ever made." And that would have gone down well with the troops.
It would have.
So his volume of bush ballads was one of the Trenches editions. But more significantly is C.J. Dennis, because C.J. Dennis's Sentimental Bloke, Ginger Mick and Digger Smith were contemporary with events happening, telling the story of the diggers themselves, because Ginger Mick was a character in the original Sentimental Bloke, and then Dennis sent him off to Gallipoli and tells the story of his experience in Gallipoli. And then Digger Smith, who was another character who was wounded, came back without a leg. He tells the story of what his experience was coming home. So they're capturing for Australia, as well as for the diggers, the experience of war and helping us come to terms with the meaning of that and the meaning of being Australian.
What has that meant to you, you know, to be involved in this project, to have a great love of books, and you're also known as Dr. Plain English, so you have a great love of expression and communication and words. What's it meant for you to be involved in this? And I suppose on Anzac Day, connect you directly to that history?
Yeah, well, I think that connection is the first thing, and that you feel you're meeting characters of the time. These characters are walking off the pages of history and into your life. The deeper connection, I think, is what they explore about what it means to be Australian, and the relevance to Anzac Day, what it meant to be an Australian in World War I, what we were doing there, trying to make sense of all of that. Because there was a lot of division at the time, the conscription debate, for example. There was a lot of sectarian division, there was a lot of class division in Australia at the time. We were only just a federated nation.
Well, many people say that's when we became a nation, in the sense that, you know, Australians started to think of themselves as Australians, was on the battlefield.
And there's an episode in which I think is the key point of Ginger Mick, where Mick, who is a working class ruffian, as you read that passage, he comes to blows with a bit of a toff. Keith is the name of a guy in his unit. And Keith, we know, is a bit upper class because he wears pyjamas and cleans his teeth. But they get trapped in no man's land ahead of the trench. And Mick is wounded, and Keith stays there to look after him. And Mick wakes up and says, no, you go back, tell the boys I'm done for. And Keith refuses to. And Mick says, what's your game? You know, what are you trying to do? And he turns and he says, I'm an Australian. Yeah. That's all he said. And that reconciled them. You know, that reconciled, even though they were different, they had differences in religion and class and so on, that commonality in being Australian, in that experience and the values that embodied was really what Dennis was capturing.
Yeah, it's a good place to finish, Neil, and I'd recommend people as well find these. They're fantastic little snapshots of history, but wonderful stories in themselves as well. Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure.